The film begins with Iris lying awake on her bed, her face clearly showing signs of insomnia. Next to her, a small toy boat rests on a wooden bedside table, symbolizing a connection to her lost son, Matteo. After a moment of silent contemplation, she gets out of bed, picking up the toy boat and a small knife before leaving the house. In her distracted state, she forgets her phone, still charging by the bed. She drives along a deserted forest road until she reaches a remote hill. At the top of the hill stands a tree where she has placed a picture of her son. This tree holds deep emotional meaning for her, as it marks the place where she buried Matteo's memory. In a ritualistic gesture, she carves the first letter of his name into the tree bark. From here, Iris walks to the edge of the cliff. Flashbacks of Matteo's tragic death flood her mind. She remembers the horrific moment when he fell from the very same cliff while playing, an accident she blames herself for. The weight of grief and guilt overwhelms her, and she resolves to end her own life. As she prepares to jump, a stranger named Richard suddenly appears. Noticing her despair, he intervenes, speaking in a calm and persuasive tone. He begins sharing a deeply personal story from his past, seemingly to convince her to reconsider. Richard tells Iris about an accident he caused during his teenage years. He recalls owning a luxurious car and recklessly driving with his girlfriend, Chloe. One day, his reckless behavior led to a devastating crash that killed Chloe and left him with multiple injuries. He admits that he spent months recovering at home, sinking into despair but eventually finding a renewed appreciation for life. Iris, moved by his story, feels a momentary connection and starts to open up. She shares her own grief, explaining how her son Matteo died, and how she's been consumed by guilt ever since. At first, Richard listens attentively, offering words of empathy that make her feel understood. But subtle changes in his tone and behavior begin to surface, introducing an air of unease. As Iris turns to leave, Richard makes a cryptic comment. "Sometimes, the life you want to escape is exactly the one I need." Iris wakes up in the back seat of a moving car, her hands tightly bound and her body tied into an uncomfortable hog-tie position. Panic quickly takes hold as she realizes her dire situation. The car sways slightly with every turn, and the faint sound of gravel crunching under the tires signals they're far from civilization. Through the haze of her grogginess, she spots Richard at the wheel, his expression cold and unreadable. Her heart races as she notices her smartwatch. Trying to suppress her panic, she begins tapping it, hoping to contact her husband. But Richard catches her movement from the corner of his eye. "Don't bother," he says calmly without even looking back. "You won't get a signal out here." Desperation sets in, and Iris pleads with him, trying to appeal to his humanity. "My husband will be looking for me. You don't have to do this," she says, her voice trembling. But Richard only chuckles darkly. "You're not the first to say that," he replies. His tone is detached, as if he's recounting a boring anecdote. He begins listing the excuses his previous victims had given, how they were mothers, how their children needed them. His indifference is chilling. He punctuates his monologue by placing her toy boat on the seat beside her, a cruel reminder of what she's lost. Through this tense exchange, Iris keeps her composure, masking her intentions. With subtle movements, she retrieves the knife hidden on her and begins to work at cutting through the plastic ties. She keeps Richard distracted, asking him pointed questions about his past. When she mentions Chloe, Richard stiffens, his calm facade slipping momentarily. He admits Chloe was beautiful, even comparing her to Iris, but Iris pushes further, trying to unearth more about his psyche while simultaneously sawing away at her restraints. "What are you planning to do to me?" she asks, her voice trembling but firm. Richard glances at her through the rearview mirror, his gaze unnervingly steady. "I have a place in the woods," he says matter-of-factly, "where I'll braid your hair." The simplicity of his words only deepens the dread. Suddenly, with a sharp movement, Iris frees herself. She lunges at Richard with the knife, the element of surprise giving her a brief advantage. The car swerves violently, crashing into a tree with a deafening crunch. Iris is thrown against the door but quickly scrambles to escape. She grabs the toy boat, stuffing it into her pocket, and bolts into the woods, her breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. But she doesn't get far. Richard steps out of the wreckage unscathed, his towering figure blocking her path. He tilts his head, almost amused by her effort. "Have you started to feel it yet?" he asks cryptically. Iris stares at him, confused and still clutching the knife. She demands. Richard calmly explains, his voice eerily clinical. that he injected her with a paralyzing agent while she was unconscious. He details the horrifying timeline of its effects. Her fine motor skills will fail within minutes, followed by a loss of control in her legs, labored breathing, and finally, complete paralysis. Realizing the truth, Iris begins to panic. She tries to run, but her knife slips from her weakening grip. The forest blurs around her as she counts her steps, trying to focus, trying to fight off the inevitable. Memories of her son flood her mind, teaching Mateo to count on his fingers, his laughter echoing in her ears. Iris snaps out of her daze when she spots Richard. However, when she tries to count using her fingers, she realizes she can't. Desperate, she sets her smartwatch to 20 minutes to track the effects of the paralyzing drug. As her condition worsens, walking becomes impossible. She drags her foot through the forest, knowing that in 3 minutes, her legs will completely give out. When they do, she resorts to crawling, her body betraying her with every agonizing movement. Richard's voice echoes menacingly as he calls out her name. In her desperation, she hides inside a tree trunk teeming with ants. The pain from the bites becomes unbearable, and she cries out despite her efforts to stay silent. Hearing her, Richard moves closer, but she musters her strength to jump into a nearby river. The current carries her away, eventually depositing her onto the lawn of a stranger's home. Now completely paralyzed, her breathing labored, she lies helpless as an old man, busy cleaning his yard with a leaf blower, notices her. Approaching cautiously, he asks if she can speak, but she cannot move her mouth. When he waves a finger in front of her face, her eyes follow the motion, giving him a clue that she's still conscious. Realizing her condition, he begins asking yes or no questions. She blinks once to affirm and twice to deny, helping him understand her situation. He promises to take her inside and call 911. She blinks once in agreement. The old man gently places her in a wheelbarrow and brings her indoors. Before he can make the call, they hear a knock at the door. Iris blinks rapidly, trying to warn him that it's Richard and that he shouldn't open it. But the old man doesn't understand her frantic blinking. He opens the door and finds a disheveled Richard standing there. Richard claims he's looking for his wife, describing her as short and pretty, and says they were in a car accident. Suspicious, the old man replies that he will call for help and closes the door. But Richard forces his way inside. He begins searching the house while the old man warns him to leave, threatening to call the police. Richard feigns concern, claiming he's lost his phone, but his behavior continues to raise red flags. The old man sits down and questions him further, asking for his name. Richard introduces himself as Andrew and says his wife Chloe has mental health issues. He spins a story about an argument during which she floored the gas pedal, causing their car to crash. He claims he can't remember what happened afterward. As the old man probes further, Richard shares a twisted philosophy, stating that the world will take what it wants, echoing something Iris had said earlier. When the old man asks if he loves his wife, Richard replies affirmatively. However, as their conversation continues, the old man becomes suspicious when Richard's phone rings in his pocket. Richard dismisses it, blaming his disorientation, and grows increasingly agitated. He demands to know where Iris is. The old man, trying to mislead him, says she's in the garden shed, but Richard doesn't believe him. While Richard is distracted, the old man seizes the moment to push him into a shelf, knocking him down. Using this advantage, he dials 911, but Richard recovers quickly. A brutal fight ensues, during which Richard grabs a knife and brutally stabs the old man. Unable to find Iris, Richard sets the house ablaze with gasoline and a match. From her hiding spot, Iris draws the blinds to get Richard's attention. When he notices her through the window, he breaks in, carries her out of the burning house, and places her in his car. He remarks that he's never killed a man before and jokingly adds, "There's a first time for everything." As they drive, Richard receives a call from his daughter, who excitedly shares her recent academic success. She mentions their plans to meet at a cabin, catching him off guard. His wife, Lizzie, takes the phone and questions his frequent solo trips, suggesting their daughter needs a change of scenery. Reluctantly, Richard agrees. Running low on fuel, they stop at a gas station. Richard places a hat on Iris to conceal her identity and steps out to fill the tank. Inside the car, Iris struggles to undo her seatbelt. A mother and child pull up nearby, and the child wanders over, peering curiously at Iris through the window. The sight of the child triggers memories of her son. The mother scolds her child for straying and casts a suspicious glance at Iris, who appears distraught. Richard quickly returns, fastening her seatbelt before driving off. They return to the crash site, where Richard transfers items from the old man's truck to his car. While he works, a police officer arrives and questions him. Richard claims his drunk wife caused the accident. As the officer inspects the car, Iris tries to call for help. Though her words are slow and slurred, the officer begins to understand. Sensing danger, Richard strikes the officer, killing him, and burns the vehicle to destroy evidence. As they continue driving, Iris questions Richard about his motives. She probes whether his actions stem from grief over his girlfriend's death. He confesses that watching his girlfriend die gave him clarity and admits, disturbingly, that he liked it. Iris pleads with him, pointing out that he still has a family and urges him to stop before he loses everything. She recounts her own loss, explaining that losing her son was unbearable. She reminds him of his own words. Broken doesn't mean hopeless. Richard scoffs at her attempts to reason with him and announces a change in plans, heading toward a pier. At the pier, Richard expresses regret that their time together was cut short. Summoning her remaining strength, Iris stabs him with a syringe, but her weakened fingers fail to inject the drug. Richard laughs, mocking her futile effort. She tearfully asks why he's doing this, revealing that she once attempted suicide at a hilltop but now wants to live. Richard coldly explains that his goal was to make her want to live, just so he could crush her hope. He hogties her and drags her onto a boat. As they sail, she notices a knife in his belt and begins crying, claiming she has one last wish: to hold her son's toy, which is in her pocket. Moved by her tears, Richard agrees and leans in. Seizing the moment, she grabs the knife and plunges it into his neck. She shoves him overboard and escapes as the boat begins to sink. Iris swims to shore and watches as Richard struggles in the water. Instead of helping, she whispers a quiet, "Thank you for giving her the will to live," and walks away.